Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving into the world of Google today with In the Plex by Stephen Levy. This book really takes us through Google's entire journey, from a couple of Stanford students with a crazy idea all the way to the global powerhouse it is today. Are you ready to unpack this?
Absolutely. Google's story is one of ambition, innovation, and really just this relentless pursuit of organizing the world's information. We'll see how all their early decisions and that very unique Google culture really shaped their path and made them the dominant force in technology that they are today.
It's so interesting because the book kicks off in a way that you don't expect at all. Like, it almost feels like a scene from a spy thriller. We've got this group of Google's top young recruits, these associate product managers, visiting a village in India back in 2007. And there are no computers, no internet. It's a world away from Google's headquarters.
Such a stark contrast. It really is. It highlights the global ambitions of Google. They were grooming these APMs for leadership roles. Exposing them to such a dramatically different environment was a way of showing them the potential scale of Google's mission. You have to remember, this is just a few years after Google's IPO. They're already thinking about reaching that next billion users.
But then Levy jumps ahead to 2010, right into a New York courtroom where Google is battling a lawsuit over their Google Book Search project. Talk about whiplash. What was going on with this lawsuit?
This lawsuit really perfectly illustrates the tension that Google always seemed to find themselves in. It was a tension between their grand vision and the existing rules of the world. They wanted to scan and digitize millions of books, make them all searchable online. So it's like a library at everyone's fingertips, but publishers saw it as massive copyright infringement.
It seems like Google kind of often operates in this gray area, pushing the boundaries of what's possible, but sometimes stepping on toes in the process.
Exactly. And that leads us right back to the beginning. Chapter 1. We meet Larry Page as a Stanford PhD student in the mid-90s. The web was still this chaotic, disorganized mess back then, and Page was just obsessed with finding a better way to navigate it.
Oh, I remember those days. Search engines like AltaVista were pretty basic. You would get a million results, most of them completely irrelevant. So it's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Page's genius was realizing that the web's structure itself held the key to better search. He saw that websites linking to each other were like these votes of confidence. So basically, the more reputable sites linking to you, the more likely your site was actually valuable.
Okay, so that's where PageRank comes in, right? It wasn't just about how many links a website had, but the quality of those links. Kind of like academic citations. The more respected papers cite your research, the more weight your work carries.
That's a great analogy. PageRank was revolutionary for search. Suddenly, results weren't just based on keywords crammed onto a web page. They were based on this measure of authority that was derived from the entire web's interconnectedness. It really was like they were bringing order to the chaos of the web.
So imagine this. Page and his friend Sergey Brin are huddled in their Stanford dorm room, building this thing called Backrub, the precursor to Google. And they're going up against these massive companies like AltaVista, armed with this radical new algorithms, like a classic Silicon Valley underdog story, right?
Absolutely. And their approach was so different. They were obsessed with speed, with automation, so obsessed that they hated the idea of manually intervening in their search results. There's this story about a website owner complaining about being excluded from Google's index. And Page and Brin basically just shrug it off, saying their algorithms would sort it out eventually.
It's like they had this almost religious faith in the power of algorithms to solve any problem.
They did. And this ethos, this unwavering belief in data-driven decision-making, it became one of the defining characteristics of Google's culture, really woven into their DNA from those early days.
Okay, so Chapter 2 plunges us into the Wild West days of the early internet. Google is growing rapidly, but they're battling all these server crashes, constantly struggling to keep up with demand. It just sounds chaotic and exhilarating.
It was. They were operating on a shoestring budget, cobbled together all this cheap hardware, constantly pushing the limits of what was even possible at that time. They even bought used hard drives from, of all places, adult websites just to get more storage space.
Yeah. Well, now that's resourceful. I guess necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
But how did they turn this chaotic startup into a viable business?
That's where AdWords comes in. And it's so interesting because it wasn't their first choice for a business model. They initially resisted advertising, fearing it would compromise the integrity of their search results, but they needed to make money. And their early attempts at other revenue streams just failed.
So they reluctantly embraced advertising. But they did it their way, right? What was so different about AdWords?
It was brilliant, really. They created a system where advertisers would bid on keywords. But the ranking of the ads wasn't just based on the highest bid. They introduced this thing called quality score. It measured how relevant and useful the ad was to the user.
So even in advertising, they were prioritizing user experience. They didn't want their search results to just become cluttered with irrelevant or spammy ads.
Exactly. And that focus on user experience, even when it came to making money, it really became a hallmark of Google's approach. It helped them build trust with users and ultimately led to the massive success of AdWords.
Chapter 3 takes a look at the evolution of Google search. It's no longer just about finding websites. It's becoming this universal tool for finding information, period.
Exactly. Remember universal search. Suddenly you weren't just searching for websites, you were getting results from images, videos, news, all in one place. Google was building this mirror world reflecting all the vastness of information online.
It's like they were saying, if it's not in Google, it doesn't exist. It's almost overwhelming to think about the amount of data they were indexing and organizing.
It does make you think. It raises some interesting questions about what happens to information that doesn't really fit neatly into their algorithms. What about the stuff that's not so easily searchable? What gets left out of Google's mirror world?
Yeah, that's a really great point. It makes you wonder about the biases inherent in any system that attempts to organize and prioritize information, doesn't it?
It does, and that's something we see come up again and again as we go deeper into Google's story.
Chapter 4 introduces AdSense. This takes their advertising model to a whole new level. Now they're no longer just running ads on their own search results pages. They're placing ads on other websites all across the entire web.
AdSense was a game changer. It allowed them to extend their reach far beyond Google.com, so they're creating this massive network of websites displaying their ads. And it was a win-win for website owners, too, because now they could earn revenue by simply displaying relevant ads on their pages.
It's like Google was creating this entire ecosystem, this interconnected web of information and advertising touching almost every corner of the internet.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, we see how Google was really rapidly becoming a dominant force in online advertising. They had search ads, they had display ads, and now they were actually controlling the ad ecosystem across the web. It was a brilliant strategy, but it also started to raise concerns about their growing power and influence.
Now, Chapter 5. It takes us right inside the Googleplex, that sprawling campus in Mountain View, California. And we really get this glimpse into that legendary Google culture.
They had this mantra, make sure it looks like a dorm room. The idea was to create a fun, informal environment where engineers felt comfortable and could be their most creative selves.
Yeah, it sounds like a dream workplace. Free food, ping pong tables, slides in the office. It's like a playground for tech geniuses, right? But was it all just fun and games?
I mean, it was about fostering collaboration and innovation. They believed that by removing any obstacles to productivity, by creating a space where people felt happy and engaged, they could unleash this incredible creativity. And, it seemed to work. Google was just pumping out these innovative products and services at this astonishing pace.
And we can't forget their unofficial motto, right? Don't be evil, which became like a guiding principle for all their actions and decisions.
It's amazing how that phrase, initially just a suggestion at a meeting, became so deeply ingrained in Google's culture. It was a reminder to always do the right thing, to use their power responsibly.
But even with this moral compass, they definitely faced their fair share of challenges and controversies. Chapter 6 takes us through their IPO. And, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride.
It really was. They wanted to do things differently, make the IPO more democratic, more fair. They even wanted potential investors to pass a quiz about Google's mission and values. Talk about setting a high bar.
That is so Google. They were idealistic and unconventional, even when it came to Wall Street. But they also made mistakes. Like, remember the Playboy interview fiasco?
Oh, yeah. That was a classic example of their idealism clashing with the realities of the financial world. They accidentally gave this interview during the quiet period before the IPO, which could have jeopardized the whole thing. A PR nightmare. But they managed to recover and eventually went public, raising billions of dollars.
Sounds like they were learning some hard lessons about navigating the world of big business while still trying to hold on to their core values.
Absolutely. And as Google continued to grow, that tension between idealism and pragmatism would only intensify.
Okay, so we left off talking about Google's IPO, and you said it was a roller coaster ride. But that's just the start of their journey, right? Where do things go from there?
Yeah. So Chapter 7 kind of throws us right into this world of Gmail. It was a product that, when it launched, it seemed almost too good to be true. I mean, can you even imagine a whole gigabyte of storage just for your email? Back then, back in 2004, that was unheard of. Hotmail and Yahoo, they were only offering a measly few megabytes.
Oh, I remember that. It must
Huh.
seem like science fiction, right? Especially because they launched Gmail on April Fool's Day. A lot of people probably thought it was a joke.
Oh, for sure. But it was this brilliant marketing move. They got everyone's attention, right? And it captured that Google spirit perfectly, that audacious spirit. They were not afraid to just completely challenge the status quo, even if it meant that people kind of raised their eyebrows at them.
And Gmail wasn't just about the storage space, right? They introduced this idea of ads that were actually relevant to what was in your emails. That was a little controversial back then, wasn't it?
Totally. Privacy advocates were not happy. They were really worried about Google snooping on all of their emails. Google's argument was that the ads were actually helpful, like a personal assistant, suggesting things that you might be interested in.
It was really a glimpse into the future that Google was building. A future where all of our data becomes this commodity, used to personalize every single one of our online experiences. It makes you think. Was that a step too far? Did it erode user trust?
You know, I think it's such a complex issue. There are no easy answers, but it definitely laid the groundwork for the data-driven world we live in today.
For sure. Okay, so Chapter 8 takes us deep inside Google's data centers. We're talking massive server farms.
Yeah.
It's the backbone of their whole empire, right? This is where all the magic happens.
It is. You know, this was the really early days of cloud computing, and Google was right at the forefront. They were building these enormous facilities, just trying to keep pace with how fast all their services were growing, and their approach was totally different from any other tech company.
Really? How so?
So they were building their own servers using all these cheap off-the-shelf components. Instead of, buying those expensive high-end servers, they're like, these hackers that were building this supercomputer out of spare parts.
That's incredible. It makes sense, though. It goes back to those scrappy, resourceful beginnings that we talked about, always finding more efficient ways to do things.
Yeah. And it meant that they could scale up incredibly quickly. They weren't afraid to experiment, try new things, push the limits of what was possible. They became obsessed with latency, with making sure all their services were as fast as possible. They even had this system where teams could trade lives in order to make their speed budgets better.
Wait, lives? What do you mean lives?
So basically, lives were these units of time that they used.
Yeah.
And if a team needed to make their service faster, they could negotiate with another team to take on some of their tasks. And that would free up time for the first team to optimize their code. It's kind of a crazy example of how they applied this data-driven approach to literally every single aspect of their operations.
Wow. Okay, so Chapter 9. This is where we get into some real estate, right?
Yeah.
Because it talks about Google secretly buying up all this land in Oregon to build this top-secret data center. It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It kind of was. It was this whole clandestine operation led by this guy, Chris Sacca. He was pretending to be from some fake company, showing up in all these small towns and trying to buy huge pieces of land without making anyone suspicious.
It was like a digital gold rush. Google quietly amassing all this incredible computing power.
Yeah,
And they were building the infrastructure that would fuel their future dominance.
exactly. And that power, that's what let them do things like MapReduce. Levy describes that in Chapter 10, this totally revolutionary system for processing massive amounts of data. They could break down any huge task into these smaller pieces, then have literally thousands of computers work on it all at the same time.
So they were not only building all the infrastructure, they were also developing the tools that would actually analyze and make sense of the vast amounts of data flowing through their systems.
Yes, and that's what led to all those innovations like Google Apps, their suite of web-based productivity tools, so Google Docs, Google Sheets, all these tools that really challenge Microsoft and their dominance in Office software.
Right. And then there's Android, their mobile operating system. That was a game changer. It's
Yeah.
hard to even imagine a world without Android phones these days.
Android was a stroke of genius. They saw that the future of computing was shifting to mobile devices, and they wanted to be right at the forefront of that revolution. And they do it by making Android free. They weren't trying to make money from Android itself. They were playing a much bigger game.
So they used Android to extend their reach into the mobile world. And with Android came mobile search, mobile ads, all these new opportunities to make money from their services on a massive scale.
Yes, and in Chapter 11, we see them getting even bolder. They start getting involved in the world of wireless spectrum auctions. They're actually thinking about becoming a wireless carrier.
Really? Google, the search engine company, was going to become a phone company. That's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. But they wanted to shake things up in the telecom industry to make sure that the internet stayed open and accessible. They even threatened to bid billions of dollars in the auction just to force the FCC to adopt these open standards. It was a total power move, and, it worked.
That's a great story. It shows how far they were willing to go to achieve their goals. They really weren't afraid to use their influence to shape the future of technology.
Exactly. And then in chapter 12, we see them tackling this communication challenge with Google Voice. Their pretty ambitious attempt to reinvent the phone.
Oh, I remember Google Voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. It unified all of your communication channels, managed your voicemail. It even transcribed your messages. It felt like the future of the phone.
And they were integrating it so deeply with all those other Google services like Gmail and Contacts. It was a glimpse into this world where all of our communications would be completely seamlessly connected. But of course, that put them in direct competition with Apple. And Apple was also making some pretty big moves in mobile with the iPhone.
Yeah. The rivalry between Google and Apple was really starting to heat up, and it ended up having this huge impact on the whole tech industry.
Definitely. And chapter 13 talks about Google making another big acquisition. They bought YouTube, that video sharing platform that was quickly becoming a global phenomenon.
I mean, YouTube was a game changer. It totally changed how we all consume video content.
It was such a perfect fit for Google, right? They were both obsessed with organizing and indexing information. But integrating YouTube wasn't easy. YouTube had copyright issues. It was having a hard time making money. And Google had to figure out how to manage this kind of unruly beast without stifling all the creativity and independence that made it special.
Yeah, that sounds like a really tricky balancing act.
Yeah.
Trying to leverage YouTube's popularity while keeping its unique culture intact.
Right. And chapter 14 continues with that theme of balancing innovation with responsibility. It talks about how Google was dealing with all these privacy concerns, security threats, and all the challenges of global expansion. Remember the Street View controversy.
Oh, yeah. That was a big one. Everyone was so mad when they found out that Google was collecting data from unsecured Wi-Fi networks while their Street View cars were driving around.
It was a massive privacy blunder. It really highlighted all the risks associated with Google's vast data collection efforts. They were also starting to get a lot of pressure from Microsoft. Microsoft was lobbying the government to investigate Google for possible antitrust violations.
So they were becoming too powerful, too dominant.
I think it's something that happens when any company reaches the scale and influence that Google had. And then there was China. Google's attempt to enter the Chinese market was just this whole saga, super complex and controversial.
I mean, China is a huge market, but it comes with so much baggage.
Yeah.
Censorship, government control, all sorts of ethical dilemmas.
Yeah. They had to make some really tough choices about balancing their values with the realities of doing business in a country like China. And in the end, they decided to pull back rather than compromise their principles. It was a bold move. It showed that they weren't just about profits.
So they were willing to put their money where their mouth was, huh? Especially when it came to their "don't be evil" motto.
It was a defining moment. But it did raise questions about whether they would be able to maintain that ethical stance as they continued to grow and as they started to expand into new markets.
For sure. So chapter 15 dives into Google Books, which was another one of those really ambitious projects that faced a ton of legal challenges. It seems like every time Google tries to do something big, something really innovative, they hit some kind of roadblock.
I know, right? They wanted to digitize every book that was ever published, make all the world's knowledge accessible to everyone. It's a really noble goal. But of course, it also raised questions about copyright, about the rights of all the authors and publishers.
It's that same tension again. Google's vision versus the existing rules of the world. They're always pushing the limits, disrupting industries, and sometimes, stepping on people's toes along the way.
It's definitely a pattern. And in chapter 16, we see them struggling in an area where, up until then, they hadn't really faced much competition: social networking.
Oh, yeah. They seem to have this real blind spot when it came to social media. Like, remember Orkut? I know it was huge in Brazil and India for a while.
Yeah.
But it never took off here in the U.S.
It's interesting, isn't it? Orkut actually started before Facebook. It launched in 2004. And initially, it grew really quickly, but for some reason, Google didn't really prioritize it. They were so focused on search and advertising, they totally missed the boat on social networking, even though they had this early lead.
Maybe it was that they just didn't really get the human element of social interaction. They were so good with algorithms and data. But social media is so much more than that. It's about connecting with people, sharing experiences, building communities.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's something that they would keep struggling with as they tried to catch up with Facebook and with all the other social media platforms that were popping up. We'll get into those struggles in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, let's just take a second and reflect on what we've learned so far.
Okay, so we were talking about Google and social media. They'd had some struggles, right?
Yes.
Even with that early lead with Orkut. So where do things go from there?
Right. Well, chapter 22 goes into the whole rise and fall of Orkut. It's easy to forget about it now, but for a while it was huge in countries like Brazil and India. Like you said, it even came before Facebook.
Yeah, and you're right. I'd almost forgotten about Orkut. So if it had such a head start, why didn't it become, the next Facebook?
Well, there are a few theories. Some people think that Google just didn't really give it enough attention. They were so focused on their core businesses that they didn't put the resources into helping Orkut grow.
It's like they had this perfect opportunity and they just let it slip away.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Another theory is that Google's culture, that very engineering-driven culture, it just didn't mesh well with social networking, the more human, touchy-feely parts of it. Google was great at algorithms, but social media is more about connecting with people on an emotional level.
Yeah. It's like they were trying to engineer social connections instead of just letting them develop organically.
Exactly. And Facebook, they were all about connecting friends and family. They understood that part so much better.
So Orkut faded away, and Facebook became the global phenomenon that we know today. Another missed opportunity for Google.
It really was. And chapter 23 brings up another missed opportunity. Dodgeball. It was a location-based social networking app that Google bought back in 2005.
Dodgeball. I feel like I've heard of it. What was that all about?
Okay, so it was kind of like a precursor to apps like Foursquare and Swarm. You would use it to check in at places, and you could see who else was nearby.
Ah, okay. Yeah, it sounds like something that could have been huge,
Yeah.
especially once smartphones started taking off.
Exactly. But again, Google didn't seem to really see the potential. They just didn't invest enough in it. And eventually the people that founded it, they just left, totally frustrated.
It's that same pattern again, isn't it? Google, this tech giant, just not quite getting the whole social interaction thing.
Yeah. And so then we get to chapter 24. This is when Google launched Buzz, their big attempt to add social features to Gmail. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. Google Buzz. Didn't that turn into kind of a privacy nightmare?
It did. Google automatically connected users to people they emailed frequently without giving them much control over their privacy.
People were so mad. It felt like this huge invasion of privacy.
Yeah, it was. And it was a big setback for Google's social ambitions. A really strong reminder about how important it is to have user trust, especially when you're dealing with sensitive information.
It seems like they were learning about social media the hard way. But they weren't giving up, were they?
Nope, not at all. So chapter 25 sort of shifts gears a bit. It gets into the rivalry between Google and Microsoft, specifically in search. Microsoft was really putting a lot of resources into Bing. They were trying to take down Google.
Oh, I remember those Bing It On ads.
Yeah.
They were kind of funny, actually.
Yeah. And Bing wasn't a bad search engine, to be honest. It had some interesting features, and it forced Google to keep innovating.
Competition is good for innovation, I guess.
Definitely. Google responded by making their algorithms better, adding new features, focusing on things like personalization and semantic search. They were not going to let Microsoft win.
Okay, so back to the social media saga. Chapter 26 covers the launch of Google plus EEL. This was their most ambitious attempt to compete with Facebook. What was different with Google plus EEL?
Well, this time they went all in. They were really trying to use that massive user base they had from products like Gmail and YouTube. They even poached this social media expert from Facebook.
Wow. They were serious this time. So did it work?
Unfortunately not. Google Plus just never really caught on, even with all that hype.
Why not? It seems like they were doing all the right things.
They were just late. Facebook was already the big player. It had that network effect. Really hard to compete with that, even with a lot of resources.
And Google Plus always felt a bit forced to me, a bit artificial. It didn't have that same, authentic feel or that organic growth like Facebook.
That's a great observation. I think it felt like they were trying too hard to create a social experience instead of let it happen naturally.
So another miss for Google in the social media world. What a story.
Right. And chapter 27 brings us up to the present day. It talks about how Google is still constantly searching for that next big innovation. They're investing a lot in AI, self-driving cars, and they keep pushing the limits of what's possible with technology.
It feels like they are always looking ahead, trying to figure out what's next.
Yeah. And now that Larry Page is back, they seem really determined to get back to that spirit of innovation that they had in those early days.
So what's the biggest takeaway after this whole deep dive into In the Plex?
For me, it's how those core values that were formed in those early days, they really shaped Google's entire journey. That relentless pursuit of information, believing in the power of algorithms, the drive to make the world a better place, it's all in this book.
It's such a fascinating story, isn't it? Full of successes and, of course, some stumbles along the way. And it makes you think about the role of technology, the power these companies have, and the responsibility that comes with that power.
Absolutely. And that's what this deep dive is all about. We want to give you the information and the insights so that you can form your own opinions about Google, about their impact, and about what role you want them to play in your life.
This book is really just the start of the conversation. Google's future and the future of information, well, they're both still being written. So what role will you play? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.